Welcome. Thank you for joining this webinar on the publication of the Niskanen Center and Clean Air Task Force report and recommendations for a more efficient, effective environmental review and permitting of the transmission system improvements that are essential for renewable energy conversion of our nation's energy supply. I'm Ted Bowling. I'm a partner here at the law firm Perkins Coie and moderator for today's webinar with Karenza Gimmer, an associate in the Energy, Environment, and Resources Practice Group at Perkins Coie. I helped draft the report with the team at the Niskanen Center and the Clean Air Task Force. Perkins Coie represents several transmission projects, and our participation in this report and this webinar does not represent the views of Perkins Coie or of any of its clients. But today, we've got leaders of the Niskanen Center and Clean Air Task Force team who will discuss their evidence-based recommendations for overcoming barriers to the federal transmission permitting. This is a detailed study of actual experience with transmission permitting and underscores the importance of permitting as part of a broader system of transmission planning, permitting, and funding. Building on the Council on Environmental Quality reports on timelines and litigation under the National Environmental Policy Act, generally this report finds that an efficient, effective environmental review and, for compliance with all applicable laws, not just NEPA, is an important part of the successful delivery of transmission improvements. It's like being part of a nutritious breakfast. The efficient permitting with public participation is necessary, but not in and of itself sufficient to meet the challenges of our energy transition. The team members are going to discuss their experience and recommendations for leadership on this energy transition that's essential for climate change adaptation, increasing the reliability and resilience of transmission infrastructure, and alleviating grid congestion. But first, I can think of no person better positioned to set the stage for why improving permitting outcomes is so important than our keynote speaker. That's Jeff Dennis. He's the Deputy Director for Transmission Development at the Department of Energy's Grid Deployment Office. Jeff has been a leader in this field. He brings to the Department of Energy, where he's been for over a year and a half, a great deal of significant policy experience, and where, from his career at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, where he was an appellate attorney, director of the Division of Policy Development, and counsel to Commissioner Norris. He was also in private practice of law, and prior to joining the Department of Energy, he was the managing director and general counsel at Advanced Energy United, where he developed strategies to increase wholesale electricity market access for advanced energy technologies, including work before FERC, the regional transmission organizations, and independent system operators. So without further ado, Jeff, please take it away.
Thanks, Ted. Appreciate the invitation to be here to set the stage a little bit. Thanks to the Niskanen Institute and the Clean Energy, the Clean Air Task Force for the invitation as well. Looking forward to hearing more about your report. So as Ted mentioned, I am the Deputy Director for Transmission at DOE's Grid Deployment Office. And if we jump to the next slide, let me give you just a little bit of a sense of what we're doing in the Grid Deployment Office. Our mission is really to press investment in electric infrastructure. As our name suggests, a focus on deployment of energy infrastructure that's needed to ensure reliability and resilience, meet rising consumer demand, and address the needs of the clean energy transition. And so we're doing this in a number of ways. We are operating bipartisan infrastructure law programs that maintain and invest in critical generation facilities. We're working to improve and expand transmission and distribution systems, develop high capacity electric transmission lines nationwide, and provide access to technical assistance from our national laboratories and others, and develop new modeling and analytical capabilities to really better understand what our transmission and distribution needs are going to be in the future and how we get there. And that's a lot of what I'll be talking about to set the stage today. So if we jump to the next slide, just a sense of where I sit in the division. So I lead our transmission work in our transmission division. In our transmission division, we're really focused on three key challenges to expanding the transmission grid at the pace we need to address all of these challenges that we've talked about. We're working on enhanced transmission planning. Planning today is siloed. It doesn't capture all of the benefits that transmission provides, nor all of the needs that we have for transmission. And so we are working with our national labs and others to develop new grid scale planning tools to really push industry planning processes forward to capturing more opportunities on a broader scale to efficiently develop transmission that meets our needs. And we're also conducting assessments of transmission needs, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. In addition, we are deploying tools recently provided to us by Congress to solve commercial gaps in the transmission development process. The lengthy timelines facing the transmission development today don't often match up with the needs of customers or the needs of the financing entities. And so we're working to solve some of those challenges. And then finally, we are working on the multifaceted problems of transmission siting and permitting, utilizing existing tools that the department has to address those challenges and try to bring efficiency and greater speed to the permitting and siting process. So let's jump to the next slide. And what I really wanted to do today to set the stage for your discussion is to talk about our major assessment of national transmission needs, which we call the National Transmission Needs Study. We conduct this study every 3 years as Congress directed in Section 216 of the Federal Power Act. And this is just sort of the table of contents to that report to show you a little bit about what that report does. But what it essentially and what Congress has required that we do is assess both current and future transmission needs. And those needs are really defined as areas of capacity and constraints and congestion that are negatively impacting consumers. And so to develop this assessment, we assessed both historical data to get a better understanding of where we have both historic and current transmission needs. The historic data that we used included several reports from a variety of different entities, wholesale market price differentials, which show us where low-cost power is unable to access consumers due to transmission constraints. In addition, we looked at future needs for transmission and identified benefits of that transmission, both through reviews of a wide variety of peer-reviewed studies, but also through capacity expansion models, those models that the industry has long used to understand under a variety of future scenarios, what will our national transmission needs look like? So if we jump to the next slide, just a quick bit of context about our report. I want to make sure folks always understand what our needs study is and what it isn't. What it is an assessment of our national transmission needs. It does not prescribe solutions, particular transmission projects that should or should not be constructed. Instead, what it does is establish a base of understanding of what our transmission needs are. As I mentioned earlier, it considers existing published data and reports, those capacity expansion models, those reports, that wholesale market price data that I talked about, about 180 in total different data sources that we use to pull together this assessment. It does not do new modeling or cost benefit analysis or any kind of system planning. We're working on other projects that is conducting new modeling, principally our National Transmission Planning Study. And as I'll show you in a minute, we organize the needs by geographic regions. Those regions aren't necessarily synonymous with any particular corridors that transmission might be cited in, or that DOE or our federal partners might identify under other programs that they're executing. So if we jump to the next slide, we can start to dive into a little bit to the transmission, the National Transmission Needs Study, our assessment, and what are our big takeaways? Well, first and foremost, we have a pressing need for new transmission infrastructure in nearly every region of the country to meet a wide variety of customer needs. But what this assessment shows is that there are significant transmission congestion and constraints happening today and expected to happen under a wide variety of future scenarios of, generation resources, shifts in generation resources, as well as a variety of future scenarios of increased demand. Second, interregional transmission facilities, those transmission facilities that often traverse longer distances or connect existing regions today, is really one of our greatest areas of need. And building those kinds of connections and increasing our ability to move energy between regions with transmission capacity provides the greatest benefit to customers. And finally, our transmission needs are going to shift over time as we see demand dynamically evolving. Really, as we talk today, we're talking more and more about how demand is shifting and how demand is really growing at exponential rates in some places, and the needs of the clean energy transition and the transition of the fleet of generation resources from those we've relied on in the past to those we will rely on in the future. Those needs will shift over time, and transmission needs shift along with them. So let's jump to the next slide and actually get into a little bit more of the meat of the results. So this just gives you a graphical depiction of the regions that we used to consider to analyze transmission needs, as well as the types of needs that we looked at. And you see 6 various sort of categories of need that we looked at over there on the right there. Those needs range from maintaining and improving the reliability and resilience of the grid, alleviating congestion on the grid and unscheduled flows today, where again, energy cannot move from where it's available to where it's needed because of capacity constraints. Alleviating transfer capacity limits between neighbors, between these neighbors where one may be experiencing an event and there is generation available in the other region, being able to deliver that through transfer capacity. And then just being able to deliver low-cost generation to regions that are anticipating or that are experiencing high prices. Those are all both current and anticipated needs. And then when we look more to the future, we looked really through those capacity expansion models on how we would meet future demands within region transmission. So what kinds of transmission needs do we have within these regions? And then what kinds of transmission needs do we anticipate between these regions? So next slide, please. This next slide is another graphical depiction of what I talked about earlier, which is the needs that we see across the nation. And as you can see there, we see a need in nearly every region of the country for additional transmission investment in the future to maintain and improve reliability and resilience. Similarly, to alleviate congestion and unscheduled flows, you see those dots there, nearly every region of the country. Those stars just indicate where we did not have robust wholesale market price data, either because an RTO or an ISO doesn't exist, or because there may not be sort of robust and liquid trading hubs that we can look at to understand how transmission constraints are affecting consumer wholesale prices. And so you can see some of the other depictions here. I won't dwell on this, but this really just makes the point that we see big needs for transmission in this assessment across all regions and between many regions as well. So let's jump ahead to the next slide. This slide just gives you another graphical depiction about how to think about regional needs. And these are those within region transmission needs I talked about. That hashed line on the left shows you the current, the amount of currently installed transmission capacity we have today. And those green bars on the right are the range of anticipated needs we saw over the scenarios we studied. These particular scenarios that are depicted on this graph are of moderate clean energy, are of moderate demand growth and high growth in clean energy based on the incentives in the Inflation Reduction Act, as well as consumer preferences, state policy preferences, things like that. If you jump to the next slide, you'll see these range of anticipated needs increase in many regions. I'm sorry, actually first, this is the interregional transfer capacity expansion results that we saw. And so again, these are scenarios of moderate demand growth and high clean energy growth. And what you see here is a significant need for increased interregional capacity between regions like PJM and the Midwest, the Mid-Atlantic and Midwest regions, between the Midwest and the Plains, and in particular between the Delta and Plains regions. You see a need for as much as 414% additional or of capacity expansion, as well as between the Plains and Texas. You see significant needs as well. If you jump to the next slide, I'll show you just briefly, and then I'll wrap up, where we see these needs growing even more when we take into account high demand scenarios. Those high demand scenarios that we are seeing, even since we published this report in October, coming into view as artificial intelligence and data centers and other things are really electrification of other parts of the economy are driving additional expansion. You see that our needs for regional transmission expansion on this slide, and then if you jump to the next slide, interregional transmission expansion grow even more. So let's jump to the next slide, because I know I want to wrap up and let you all get to your discussion of future potential permitting reforms. But let me just quickly highlight what we are doing at GDO to work on transmission siting and permitting activities with existing authority. We are revitalizing authority that the DOE has long held under the Federal Power Act to coordinate federal authorizations and act as the lead agency. This is our site app program. Under this program has been revitalized under an MOU signed by 9 federal agencies at the direction of the White House. And those 9 agencies have agreed to participate in a coordinated process led by DOE and to reach decisions on federal authorizations and related environmental reviews within a 2-year timeframe from the issuance of a notice of intent to prepare an environmental impact statement to a record of decision. We issued a notice of proposed rulemaking last year, and we intend to issue a final rule very quickly. In addition, we are designating national interest transmission corridors. These are areas of the country experiencing transmission capacity constraints or congestion negatively impacting consumers, either now or in the future, based on the results of the needs study I just talked about and other discretionary criteria. These corridors allow transmission projects within them to access important federal financing tools and to access the potential for FERC to issue a federal permit in certain instances where states either lack the authority or have denied permits as well. We're right in the middle of that process now. We've taken a round of public information submissions on where these corridors should be, and we're working to issue a preliminary list of potential NITSI corridors in coming months for additional public input, as well as the initial phases of community input in areas where those corridors may be located. And then finally, on the last slide, we are working on providing grants to states and other siting authorities, as well as local communities, to help them with the process of considering applications for federal or for permits to site transmission. This program, we've taken applications. We will receive full applications this coming Friday, and then we will start working on the process of developing grants. The goal here is to ensure that communities are receiving benefits, as well as to help states who are going to see more and more applications for transmission projects really work through those applications, and these grants can be used to fund a number of their siting authorities. So with that, I will turn it back over. Thanks for the opportunity to kick off your webinar today.
Thank you so much, Jeff, and thank you for your public service. All right. Well, we're going to now move into an overview of the key findings and recommendations. For that, we have Johan Kavert and Megan Gibson of the Niskanen Center, and Alex Burkell and Nicole Pavia of the Clean Air Task Force. And what I'm going to start off with just a little bit of sort of, some thoughts on the broader significance and sort of background of NEPA in this regard. And I'll spare you the PowerPoint here. I think this is the culmination of years of effort, and it all goes back to really sort of the founding of NEPA. I mean, it comes down to NEPA implementation, the day-to-day management of environmental review processes that are key to meeting the big challenges that NEPA was designed to take on. And as the report says, I mean, we are falling behind. So far, the U.S. has not kept pace with the challenge to make a 3 to 4-fold increase in transmission capacity required to meet the burgeoning demand as well as the climate challenge. And in fact, there's actually been an overall decrease in annual transmission investment for large power lines, the kinds that really, move between regions the way Jeff was talking about. And that decline occurred between 2010 and 2020. The nation's investment requirements are going to reach up into 40 billion annually by 2031. So as discussed in this report, what we need to do is develop transmission to meet these emergent needs and the significant challenges in how transmission is planned, permitted, and financed. The NEPA process is designed to take on these big decisions. It establishes a framework for environmental review. It forms a substantial part of the record of agency decisions and supports greater public awareness and participation in influencing the outcome of agency decisions and basically make better decisions and keep the federal government in a federal system of government coordinated. It's foundational to community and environmental protections. NEPA process has evolved significantly since it was established in 1970. It started off more as sort of a federal agency action framework, but as Jeff talked about with the TSED grants, and it's very much more a sort of a funding model and authorization model at this point. Most of the recent changes in NEPA process, including 2020 amendments to the CEQ NEPA regulations, were enacted by the first significant amendments to NEPA since its enactment in 1970, and that was in the Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2023. And more changes to come in pending updates to NEPA that are pending at the Council on Environmental Quality. But throughout it all, I mean, this NEPA process as part of the coordinating overall permitting processes support important functions of environmental community protection, facilitating interagency coordination. There are probably more reforms to come, but there's a continual need for continual improvement here. I mean, some of the examples of recent reforms, including the role of the Permitting Council established by Title 41 of the FAST Act, as well as also, as Jeff noted, the Federal Power Act, Section 216 MOU, which gives Department of Energy a lead agency authority, and its program of coordinated interagency transmission authorizations and permits, or CITAP. As I said, it all comes down to implementation. I mean, in my experience, during my 15 years at the Council on Environmental Quality in particular, we found this to be true with big projects like the implementation of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, and big data sets like the comprehensive litigation survey that we did starting in 2000, as well as the environmental impact statement timelines analysis that CEQ did for a data set covering 2010 to 2018. I mean, that the litigation survey showed that fewer than half of environmental impact statements and many fewer than the EAs were subject to litigation. EAs represent and categorical exclusions represent about 98% of agency NEPA practice, and they're rarely the subject of litigation. But in 2020, CEQ began an examination of over 1,200 environmental impact statements for which notices of availability were published beginning in January 2010, carrying on through 2018, and for which there was a record decision. And CEQ found median EIS completion timeline was 3.5 years. The average is 4.5 years, and the reason for that difference there is because there are many factors, many differences in the way NEPA processes carry out. In particular, there are extensions or delays that occur due to changes in proposed actions or funding, community concerns. And similarly, EIS processes for large infrastructure projects vary considerably from those associated with rulemakings or land management planning processes that are largely in control of the federal agency. Necessarily, there's an interaction with multiple actors for large infrastructure projects. So the work that the Niskanen Center and the Clean Air Task Force have undertaken is a significant undertaking focused on the important problem of transmission. It was a large team that contributed to this effort. I commend to you the opening pages of the report, which call out each individual member. But I will ask Johan to take on with a high-level overview of some of this quantitative analysis and your takeaways. So, Johan?
Thank you so much, Ted, and thank you as well to Jet for the opening remarks. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about just sort of some of the research process that underlaid a lot of our recommendations and findings today, and then also dive a little bit more into the data. So basically, just to reiterate, a lot of this sort of came about, and the impetus for this was that we really wanted to create an evidentiary record based on data that's oftentimes difficult to find and access publicly about transmission permitting at the federal level, and really sort of inform the public debate through compiling that and writing about that. And the way we did that is we embarked on this long, rigorous research survey of the current state of transmission permitting at the federal level. And there were a number of different sort of complementary areas of research that we took on. So first thing is we gathered a lot of background on the federal transmission process, like Ted had mentioned. So we interviewed federal officials, developers, tribal energy and infrastructure experts, and other stakeholders who had firsthand experience in the permitting process. In collaboration, Ted mentioned some of the folks that we've collaborated with, and just want to say again that there are many, and we're very grateful for all of their contributions throughout this entire project. And two of the folks that we were lucky to collaborate were former FERC attorneys Niles Nichols and Elizabeth Blaug, and together we compiled case studies for 37 different transmission projects that underwent federal review between 2010 and 2020. In addition, we compiled data and statistics for that same subset of transmission lines. And there's a whole separate data report that we published about that, and I'm going to talk about some of our results from that in a little bit here. Additionally, we recognize that legal and community opposition are oftentimes at least flagged as key barriers to transmission build-out, and so we wanted to investigate that further, and our legal team looked at the litigation history of all 37 of those projects. And then last of all, we were incredibly grateful and lucky to have a really stellar advisor group working with us. They informed and guided a lot of our efforts and lent us review and suggestions. And we're very thankful for all of their time and contributions. So in sum, I guess all of those different sort of component parts really fed into the recommendations that we're going to talk about in a little bit here today. And before we get to that, I'm going to say a little bit more about some of the findings from our data analysis. So this is a project that I did in collaboration with my colleagues Natalie Manicius at CATF and Casey Kelly at ClearPath, and as well as our general organizations all work together on this. And again, this work was really done because we identified sort of the lack of comprehensive information about transmission permitting at the federal level, and wanted to sort of create a public resource that could sort of speak to that and inform that. So we identified 37 lines, which you can see on the map here, and those were selected because they fit the following criteria, which I'll outline briefly. So we chose only new lines, and that means that we excluded any transmission lines that were rebuilds or upgrades. We also set a specific time period that we were looking at. So we looked at projects that had an EIS in progress or completed between 2010 and 2020 in that decade. And then we also selected lines that were 115 kilovolts and above and 5 miles in length or longer. So if you go to the next slide, we have some of the key takeaways from some of that data analysis. And as I said before, there's a whole nother report that we've published a little bit back that you can look for more information. But some of the key findings here, I think first up is just that lines that underwent an EIS review represented only 3.5% of all new projects in that decade-long period, but a quarter of all new line miles, which I think is really a standout finding. We also found that projects that require federal permitting were more than 7 times longer in length than average transmission projects, which is also, I think, pretty significant. And to break it down, what we found is that transmission lines that required an EIS had an average line length of 192 miles, which is significantly longer than the average of 26 miles for all new lines in the bulk power system. And I think that just sort of speaks to the differences in the kinds of lines and what that typical profile looks like, and why those transmission lines going through an EIS oftentimes are so complicated and so have so many component pieces. And then lastly, we also, as you can see here in the table, we looked at general average timeline for permitting, and we measured this from NOI to ROD, and we found that EIS reviews across all electric transmission projects in our database took an average of 4.3 years. So happy to dig into that some more, and encourage you all to check out those statistics. And also we have that full database that we encourage people to play around with and use. We hope it's a public resource for everyone. So with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Megan.
Thank you, Johan, and good afternoon, all. As we transition from our methodology into the substance of our findings, another pivotal aspect we scrutinized closely was litigation and substantial opposition to these projects. And a big reason for this specific examination is that litigation and opposition are often held up as a major issue in transmission permitting. Now, it's no secret that substantial opposition through litigation or other means can potentially impact the timeline and or the feasibility of transmission projects, but it's truly an open pending question of how much and or to what degree said opposition has an impact, thus making it an area of focus here, the heavy lifting of which was done by Olga Baranoff, a Niskanen consultant, and Zach Norris, who is a senior attorney at Niskanen. And they published a commentary on this, which we can hopefully drop in the chat here or share after the webinar. Now, our analysis revealed that while opposition and litigation against projects are highlighted at times as primary hurdles to completion, the actual impact is far more nuanced. It's imperative, however, to acknowledge the limitations of our findings, given the vast complexity of planning, permitting, financing, and constructing these large projects. It's difficult, really, to draw conclusive causal links between opposition and negative project outcomes. However, with a modest degree of certainty, our research suggests substantial opposition does, in fact, contribute to adverse project outcomes. So we reviewed the same data set or group of projects that Johan discussed. And as you can see here on the DEX chart, we found that most, or 54% of those lines, faced little to no opposition. And of the remaining 17 projects that did face substantial opposition, 22% faced substantial opposition, but not litigation. Nobody filed anything against them in court. And 9 or 24% of the projects faced litigation. And of the total amount of all the projects that faced opposition, 27% were either delayed or canceled. Now, the examination of opposition against projects did yield some enlightening insights, notably that a significant portion of projects proceeded to completion despite facing opposition, which underscores really the resilience of these projects. However, as just noted, there was a positive correlation between the presence of such opposition and delays or cancellations in that subset of cases. And this generally all highlights the need, frankly, for robust stakeholder engagement early and often with impacted parties, truly listening to and addressing their concerns to the extent possible, which I can personally attest to after over a decade of litigating myself, and my colleagues will touch upon that more later on. But this nuanced understanding of litigation's impact, emphasizing that its role, while it can be significant, interacts with a myriad of other factors, really sets the table for our recommendations. And as my colleague Johan previously outlined, the genesis of our recommendations lies in an exhaustive investigative effort combining data analysis, stakeholder interviews, and comprehensive case studies. And the reason we embarked on this research adventure was because there is a lack of organized, readily accessible data available on these large-scale projects. And our rigorous approach culminated in a suite of 14 recommendations aimed at enhancing the political durability, impact, and actionability of these reforms. And a notable aspect of our recommendations is the strategic focus on leveraging existing authorities and tools available to federal agencies and the administration. While acknowledging that certain recommendations may necessitate congressional action or funding, the majority are designed to optimize current resources and frameworks. And this approach is pivotal. It ensures that our recommendations are not only grounded in the reality of the current regulatory and political landscape, but are also feasible and implementable within it. So with that, the next and last of my slides, please. Our recommendations are categorized into 3 primary areas. First, enhancing federal agency coordination, cooperation, and capacity. Second, streamlining interactions between and among sovereign authorities, such as states, tribes, and the federal government. And lastly, refining the environmental permitting review process. Each category addresses fundamental aspects of the permitting process where targeted improvements can really significantly accelerate deployment. Now, while our recommendations are informed by a detailed analysis of challenges and obstacles in the permitting process, they are not prescriptive fixes guaranteed to address all underlying issues. As we all very well know, there is no silver bullet. Instead, they represent strategic interventions that, when implemented collectively, they can create, hopefully, a more efficient, effective, and equitable permitting landscape. And ultimately, by focusing on enhancing existing processes and frameworks, our recommendations aim to navigate the complex regulatory environment effectively, promoting the development of this critical transmission infrastructure while upholding the commitment to community and environmental protection. So with that, I'll turn it to my esteemed colleagues, Alex and Nicole from CATF, to give an overview of our recommendations.
Great, thanks, Megan. I'm excited to jump into the recommendations, but before I do, a quick reminder that these recommendations are CATF's and the Niskanen Center's, and they are in no way endorsed by Ted Bowling, Jeff Dennis, the organizations they represent, nor that of our advisory group members who are listed in the preamble of the report. So as Megan noted, the first set of recommendations focuses on improving coordination, cooperation, and capacity and between federal agencies participating in the permitting process. Building major new transmission lines supports national security, environmental goals, and resiliency. And as such, we feel that it's imperative that the White House, under any political administration, make transmission infrastructure a national priority. As Jeff Dennis's remarks at the top of the webinar suggest, the Biden administration has demonstrated tremendous executive leadership on transmission. But of course, the job of building infrastructure is never really done. Our report recommends going even further and specifically identifying key actors and positions responsible for the permitting process to help coordinate and resolve disputes, clarify interagency responsibilities, and ultimately to reduce review timelines. The federal government should also focus on enhancing transparency in the permitting process and timelines. We think that could be done through more expansive use of existing tools like the permitting dashboard to track goals and key information for major transmission infrastructure projects, no matter whether they're covered by Title 41 of the FAST Act or not. We think that would make invaluable project information more easily accessible to the public, to policymakers, and developers. Furthermore, an agile permitting process with continuous and consistent communication among federal agencies, project developers, and key stakeholders to address concerns early and often will reduce miscommunication and redundancies, speeding and making the permitting process more effective. And as will be no surprise, a key concern we heard from our stakeholder interviews was that agencies are short on human and financial resources. But our research also found that increasing funding and headcount alone will fail to address the core problem. Hiring and retaining agency staff with specialized knowledge of linear infrastructure and electricity transmission permitting specifically, and providing them clear reporting chains to senior appointed officials can greatly improve the permitting process. Next slide, please. Our second set of recommendations focus on coordinating and streamlining interactions among and between federal agencies, tribes, and states with congressional support. Similar to our recommendation to improve federal agency capacity, providing states and tribes with capacity to support their full participation and engagement in the federal permitting process, and that would include funding and technical assistance support, can help build support for projects while speeding permitting timelines. The report also recommends Congress federalize the permitting and siting of major multi-state projects that are in the national public interest. These interstate lines offer significant regional and national benefits, but can face community acceptance challenges at the local level. Congress can build on FERC's current backstop siting authority by granting comprehensive federal permitting and siting powers for these projects. And while we focused on federal permitting process, the interface of federal and state processes came up time and time again in our interviews with developers and permitting officials. So we recommend that states harmonize their permitting processes between themselves and with the federal process to create regulatory efficiency and allow for more concurrent processes. Furthermore, the Permitting Council can serve an important coordinator role among key permitting officials at federal agencies, specifically the Chief Environmental Review and Permitting Officers, sometimes called SERPOs, to ensure cross-agency and cross-jurisdictional alignment. And I will hand it off to Nicole to cover the remaining recommendations.
Thank you, Alex, and thanks everybody for joining. So far, our recommendations have addressed improved capacity, coordination, and transparency, as well as streamlining interactions among federal agencies, states, and tribal nations. And our third and final set of recommendations focuses on improving the federal environmental permitting and review process itself. Existing permitting and stakeholder engagement practices can be standardized and clarified, and emerging opportunities to streamline permitting should be implemented effectively and responsibly. So one of the best practices we saw cited frequently, both in the literature and when talking to our developer and transmission stakeholder interviewees, is the importance of early, sustained, and meaningful community outreach and coordination. Agencies and developers should be engaging with communities throughout the entire permitting process from beginning to end. Opportunities to collaborate proactively, such as when selecting route alternatives, for example, can minimize risk later on in the project lifecycle while also building really important community acceptance. Another process that we've understood from our research lacks clarity at the moment is the pre-filing process, or the work that precedes the formal start of the permitting process. Streamlined and clear pre-filing processes can set expectations for applicants, which can reduce the time needed to develop the public record while also ensuring environmental protection and sufficient public engagement. The Department of Energy's proposed SciTap program that Jeff mentioned earlier is definitely a step forward in this regard and would improve upon existing processes and help set milestones and deadlines for authorization and environmental reviews. Agencies should implement their own pre-filing processes and encourage applicants to opt into pre-filing where they can. And where responsible and feasible, agencies can also consider expanded use of categorical exclusions for transmission, but it's important to note that these should be applied with adequate environmental and community safeguards. Agencies can also consider programmatic environmental impact statements, or EISs, for transmission where appropriate. These programmatic EISs are broader environmental reviews that consider the impacts of programmatic federal actions, such as actions occurring in the same geography or actions with similarities like timing, impact, implementation, subject matter, etc. These EISs can also provide a foundation for subsequent tiered environmental reviews for similar projects, which can save time in the permitting process for those projects as well. And another emerging area that I see there's a question in the chat about that we'll build upon later is the National Interest Electric Transmission Corridors, or NITSEs, that Jeff also started to refer to in his remarks. Within these corridors, which are to be identified by the Department of Energy after a stakeholder engagement process, where transmission is critically needed to reduce impacts on ratepayers and to relieve congestion, there is the possibility that FERC could apply its backstop siting authority in those corridors. So as these corridors are selected and the processes continue to flesh out, DOE and FERC should work together and collaborate to eliminate any redundancies or potential redundancies in environmental review processes to make the build-out of transmission in these corridors as effective and successful as possible. And we can dive into that more in the Q&A as well. Next slide, please. So we've covered all of our recommendations, and now I want to cover some promising areas for future research. So as you can imagine, throughout the course of our work, many avenues for continued research emerged. And like Alex mentioned, though this report focused on federal matters mostly, interviews and our data analysis continuously showed the importance of the state-federal interaction, but also the harmonization of state regulatory requirements and processes with other state regulatory requirements and processes, and how important that is to the success of interstate transmission lines. So we think that there's more that can be done to investigate those maybe potential federal incentives to smooth out regulatory differences between states, or other ways to incentivize states to work together and coordinate more effectively. And while our report identified several existing authorities and tools that can be better leveraged to improve the permitting process, it is almost nearly certain that there are other federal authorities already in effect that we did not explicitly identify in this report, but that could be looked into and potentially used more fully. And one final area to mention is that we recommend a deeper dive into the impact of litigation on projects. As Megan alluded to, this is a very complex area, and it's really hard to identify causal links. In our research, we found that in our analysis, most lawsuits ultimately decided in favor of the projects, or the projects inevitably got built. However, it's difficult to suss out the threat of litigation and how that impacts whether projects, get started in the permitting process and get off the ground. And so that's something that could potentially be dug into more and deserves further scrutiny. So at this point, I would like to thank everyone for your attention so far. We reviewed our methodology, our recommendations for the report, and now we're looking forward to your questions. So for that, I'll pass it back to Ted. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nicole. And so to start off with we've got about 10 minutes left for questions here. And I want to start off with you, Nicole. We've got one asking that we please discuss NEPA applicability to transmission line projects. And will NEPA apply to the NIATC designations or to any permitting action by FERC? And let's just start off by noting that this is historically been an area of state jurisdiction. The federal role can be limited and has evolved over time. I mean, your classic stream crossing, say across a navigable river would be regulated by, say, like the Army Corps of Engineers, but generally that's done under Nationwide Permit 57. It's a programmatic environmental assessment. As Johan noted, it's only a subset of projects that require a full environmental impact statement, but that's an important subset in terms of the length of them. So, Nicole, can you address how you think the NIATCs will play into this?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned, and as Jeff mentioned as well, this process is kicking off. There's been a bunch of comments coming into DOE. DOE will eventually select corridors. And now there's been some discussion among the energy community about the potential for double NEPA applicability. So when people say that, they're referring to the possibility that when DOE designates the NITSE corridor, it might then be subject to NEPA review. But it also might be eligible for an additional NEPA review if FERC decides to leverage its backstop siting authority. And so, of course, I don't think any developer or anyone interested in the build-out of transmission wants to duplicate the NEPA process. And so my understanding in talking with stakeholders is that this situation is well known, and people are looking into how to reduce redundancies there. So yeah, I think there's more to come on that topic, Ted.
Yeah. And okay, so next question I want to throw to Johan. So, the CEQ NEPA study found, timelines for EISs varied amongst agencies. I would note Federal Energy Regulatory Commission generally got their EISs done in about 2.25 years. But what did you find with regard to, in favorable conditions, doing everything right? What's a reasonable time frame, the shortest likely time frame for completing an EIS for a transmission line?
Yeah, thanks, Ted. And definitely point people to that CEQ study because I think it's a great resource. Within our own data set, and again, this is just looking at those specific lines that I talked about that fit our criteria. I would say if you look at the chart earlier in the presentation, it sort of bunches up pretty early on, about 1 to 3 years. But just to reiterate, the average timeline that we saw between NOI to ROD took about 4.3 years, and the median there was 3.7 years. So a little bit shorter, and the range, I think, pretty heavily weighted towards the front end of that, but the range was 1 to 11 years. So there are some outliers there for sure.
All right. And then a question for Alex. So what are the biggest sources of delay or the biggest areas of controversy and opposition that you see?
Yeah, for the permitting process itself, I think a large part of, source of delay that we heard was sequential processes. Having one agency not begin their official review process until another had completed that. And that was both at the federal level and then between federal, state, and tribal jurisdictions where those jurisdictions had an overlap. And as a general matter, I think one of the challenges with any linear project of this scale is that they're really difficult and take a lot of time to plan as a general matter, not just the permitting process. So the actual planning of the facility, making sure the routing was correct, doing the environmental studies, all of that's kind of adjacent to but not core to the federal environmental review process, are also very time intensive. So one of the common policy reform points that came up was about time frames and time limits for environmental review. one thing we heard from developers is that even just the development process, taking the permitting process aside completely, is so unpredictable and time intensive that it would be even hard for them to meet some of the time targets that have been put forward in the latest round of NEPA reforms. So that's just they're very, very difficult projects to build generally and permit specifically, and we found multiple sources of delay.
And would you say there's something of a chilling effect in mandating timelines that aren't, specifically adapted to the projects?
One thing that we heard is that timelines as a general matter can be very helpful for improving accountability and providing discipline and focus on moving through the permitting process. But when those timelines become binding, to the degree those timelines are binding and have consequences for the outcome of the permitting process, that's when developers were a little less enthusiastic about the benefits of those potential reforms.
Okay, good. And Megan, so of course, we've had recent amendments to NEPA. You have the requirement that to the extent practicable, if an agency action is going to require more than one federal agency involved, then the lead and cooperating agencies need to work on one environmental document. Are there other laws out there, changes in law that you want to point to in terms of federal authorities that could be better utilized?
Yeah, absolutely, Ted. And I think the answer to that question really, permeates the report, and that we talk about existing authorities throughout, existing statutory authority as well as regulatory authority, many of which we've already gone over, starting with at the cabinet level alignment and coordination and prioritization of a lot of these projects. But one thing that's already been mentioned that we could immediately do is that the Department of Energy, the Steering Council, and other agencies could ensure that all transmission projects requiring an EIS review are added to the dashboard before filing a notice of intent. This would increase transparency as well as the data that's readily accessible to others, as well as coordination, enhancing state and tribal capacity through dedicated grant programs, technical support, and best practices sharing is something that we could immediately do. As well as, at the state level, as Alex touched upon, harmonizing state permitting processes to be concurrent with federal reviews, as well as improving regulatory efficiency.
Excellent. Excellent. All right. We've just got a couple minutes left, but I'm going to throw it back to Nicole. So what are some of the common themes that you heard in your interviews with developers and key actors in the permitting process?
Yeah, thanks, Ted. I have to say, speaking with developers and other permitting process stakeholders was really, really critical and so important to this work. There are many nuances that do not appear in EISs and in the public record that are really, really important to the permitting process. And so I think the first major theme we heard was the importance of communication and coordination between federal agencies and the developers, and vice versa. So essentially all of this kind of ties back to the capacity issue as well that came up in our recommendations. Essentially all of the developers we spoke with mentioned how additional specialized capacity familiar with transmission and linear infrastructure specifically would help the permitting process go smoothly. Just having someone on the other end of the phone to call and get updates from is really, really helpful. I think we heard a similar thing from a lot of agencies we spoke to. Many of these agencies cover a wide variety of topics. Transmission is just one sliver of the things that they cover. And I think that having a dedicated person there and that dedicated skill set would be really, really valuable for them as well. Another thing I think we heard was the necessity of alignment among federal agencies early in the process, that they are coordinating and talking with each other. And that provides a lot more certainty for those agencies, delegates responsibilities, and then also gives the developers a clear path as to who to speak with and when, and which documents they need to file. And I'll mention one other thing to close out this question is that we heard a lot about the criticality of tribal engagement. And for too long, tribes have not been adequately engaged in, or they've been actively excluded from transmission project planning that has impacted their communities and their lands. And so one of our recommendations in the report is that it's very, very clear and critical that federal engagement with tribes should rise to the level of its engagement with states and other sovereign entities.
Excellent. I think you've given us a great last word on the subject and the importance of including disadvantaged communities. Alex, do you want to have a last word regarding the immediate next steps for this report?
Sure, thanks. I know that we're at time, so I'll be really quick. I think the immediate next step in my mind is really just the continued discipline to focus on transmission infrastructure deployment as a top national priority that we know it is for all the reasons that we talked about at the top of this discussion. And that is from the White House all the way down through the field offices and staff that are actually doing the work on the ground. And I think, as Megan already mentioned, leveraging existing tools where we can do them both for improving transparency and supporting third parties and the permitting process itself can be an enormous win that's very, very easy, readily available. With that, I'll leave it at that since we're at time.
Wonderful. Yes, I've heard the chimes at the church next to my office, so it's 2 o'clock and time to wrap up. Thank you all so much.